I feel like we spend a lot of time on this podcast trying to understand the difference between how things appear and how they actually are. That might mean, as we discussed with Cory Doctorow last week, the reality behind the appearance of the worlds of tech, the internet, and artificial intelligence. Or, as we've come back to multiple times, the complex geopolitical shifts in the Middle East, as in the episode before that. We try to see behind the appearance and through the disorder. That also applies to the differences between how societies are apparently organized and how they are actually organized. And crime is a surprisingly good lens through which to understand the construction and destruction of societies. It's a side of the modern world that we choose not to see, a side that isn't just messy, but also ugly, a side we'd prefer not to acknowledge, but which affects every single one of us every day. Now, we've touched on this in the past. When we brought Oliver Bulow onto the podcast back in 2022, he told us how Britain was willing to turn a blind eye to overseas corruption because of the profits that could be made by offering a financial safe haven to the world's wealthiest. This blurring of the line between what's acceptable and what isn't, the legal and the criminal, happens all around us. It's the topic of a new book by the historian and writer Mark Galeotti. This is the modern world, he writes in his new book, Homo Criminalis. Largely legal, orderly, regulated and stable, but behind the scenes awash in dirty money, riddled with compromise, fraud and financial crime, plundering its own habitat to ruin, and as globalized in the criminal as the legal economy. Mark's book is a sweeping history of organized crime around the world, from bandits in China, the Barbary corsairs to the Russian mafia. Mark sets out to show how the modern world reflects and has been shaped by its dark underbelly. I'm also especially interested in this topic because it's one that we've seen very clearly in the modern destruction and remaking of nation-states. You saw how, during the Syrian civil war, criminal networks emerged to fill the role of the state. In Iraq, after the invasion of 2003 and the breaking apart of the state, once again, new networks of control emerged. So this story isn't just a historical story, it's a very modern one. I brought Mark onto the podcast to discuss Homo Criminalis, but I've also been wanting to bring him on for some time given his expertise on Russia, a subject he speaks on with passion and I think real clarity. It's a topic we need to understand even if we think the war in Ukraine is safely on the other side of the Atlantic or on Europe's eastern edge or coming to a conclusion. Because as Mark says, we all operate on a spectrum of conflict with everyone else. Mark and I discussed US President Donald Trump's controversial peace plan for the Ukraine conflict, which, while he maintains it needs plenty of improvement, says it might represent a starting point and the beginning of the end. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Mark Galeotti, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
I'm very pleased to have you on because, like me, I think you're fascinated by the logistics of big crime and the kind of the grand moxie of it all, you know, the kind of if you build it, they will come nature of these schemes. And I wanted to start by telling a story from your book, or perhaps having you tell it, that brings together some of the themes we are discussing. The story I'm thinking about is this attempt to buy a Russian submarine by the Cali drug cartel. Do you want to tell it, or shall I summarize it?
Well, so you summarize it because in some ways it's always interesting to find out what readers pick up on what you write.
Okay. Well, so this is a story that you write about in the book in the mid-1990s. And the plan was, this is as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the plan was that a Russian admiral would buy the submarine and then would sell it to the Colombian drug cartel for like $35 million. And the idea was that it had this distinct advantage because you could just travel from Latin America straight to Europe underground. You wouldn't need to be under the water. You wouldn't need to be refueled. Now, that deal didn't happen, as you put it in the book, because of FBI wiretaps and a falling out between thieves. But the reason I think it's so interesting is that it provides this immediate way into some of the themes that we'll be talking about today. One is, of course, Russia, which we'll come back to. But the other is the big money nature of these criminal organizations. Like they were planning to buy it from this organization in Miami. They were planning to raise $5 million. $5 million is a lot of money today. In the 1990s, it was really a lot of money, and yet they were planning to find a way to finance it. And then at the same time, very last thing is about the kind of newsy nature of it. You know, one of these boats that the US military has been hit off the coast of Venezuela is one of these drug submarines that the cartels have built. So the story you tell in the book is 30 years ago, and yet it's still with us in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd also add that for me, one of the fascinating things about this particular story is, I mean, apart from the fact that it's clearly sort of it is made for movie, even if it perhaps a sort of straight to DVD release, is precisely, on the one hand, it's incredibly ambitious and it speaks to shifting geopolitics and the collapse of the Soviet Union and so forth. Yeah. And it demonstrates the extraordinary entrepreneurialism in the underworld. But also, I mean, the three guys who were behind it were three gonzo morons. We have a tendency to assume that the massive operations must require some kind of James Bond villain-like sophistication. And instead, what it just reminds us is that a lot of it is just the workings of a whole bunch of no-hopers with grand dreams, most of whom will fail. But the point is, it's the handful who succeed who end up driving the whole process forward. And I think it's this, in some ways, look, I mean, I hate to sound as if I'm an organised crime fanboy. I mean, I'm fascinated by it, but no, on the whole, these are ghastly people, especially I know from the ones I've met. But it is a fascinating example of, I suppose, how human enterprise works. Yeah. Is this constant, you know, there are always going to be people who dream big, most who will fall on their faces, but some won't.
It's sort of a reflection of the genius of the market in some ways, that these people are pure entrepreneurs in many ways. They see something, and even if it's illegal, they say, well, I mean, if people want it, I'll provide it to them. And they take enormous risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, because in part it's the dream that they're not going to be the ones who get caught and such like. I mean, there was this wonderful study actually in the book Freakonomics, looking at the fact that, you know, most drug dealers would earn more money if they just stacked shelves at their local supermarket.
Oh, yes. Right. I remember reading that, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but the point is they all believe that they're going to be the one who are going to end up the successful ones, the drug barons with their pimpmobiles and you name it. Yeah. Again, it's the triumph ultimately of entrepreneurialism, but also optimism over common sense.
Well, I think sometimes that you don't, because I think Freakonomics also says this in the book, that what they're really seeking is those 2-3 years of the lifestyle of being in the nightclubs and having the money and the women and all of that. And they get that for 2-3 years, and they spend 20-30 years, you know, in a concrete box. But I wonder if sometimes even when it's glamorized in the movies, like it's in Scarface, people seem to misunderstand the message of Scarface. They think that it's really a success story. The guy ends up killed, and he's only a drug kingpin for a couple of years. It's not as if he's there for like 20 years. Even the guy, I don't know how much you remember the story, but even the person that he usurps, the kingpin that he takes over from, that he eventually kills, that man was in business for 20 years. So he actually ended up doing it properly. We seem to have diverted into why Scarface was an accurate
Well, I mean,
movie.
but at least then it does allow me to bring up one of my favourite lines from a Bond movie. I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's the one where he's tackling Latin American drug cartels. And there is a point when the sort of the cartel chief is threatening the sort of banana Republican president whom he's installed and said, remember, you're only president for life. Which, after all, can be a long or a very short period, if you think about it.
Well, I mean, I suppose that leads to something that I've heard you say this in other interviews, which is that the way that these criminal networks are organized in some ways reflects the ways that proto-states are organized. And we're not merely talking about your other area of interest, which is Russia, which has become a kind of gangster republic, but we're talking about even the emergence of other states. So maybe let's start with that a little bit, because that's part of the thesis that you're exploring in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, and here I'm approaching it as a historian, is if you look at how states emerge, it's very rare that communities get together and say, you know what we need? We need a king who can tax us. Instead, what tends to happen is precisely those people who are the most effective at deploying violence and yet also have the biggest dreams. I mean, there's the classic Manco Olson's notion that there are the roving bandits and the stationary bandits. Roving bandits will come in, steal everything they possibly can, regardless of the long-term health of the community they're victimizing, because they don't care about it, because then they're going to move on and predate on someone else. And then the stationary bandits roll in and take over, and yes, they will steal, but they will steal only up to the point, again, like any good parasite, you don't want to kill your host. So you steal up to the point where you have a good life, but your community still survives. And so it starts in that kind of very predatory way. But after a certain point, well, look, you need to defend the turf that you've now taken over from other bandits. And, well, you have to sleep sometimes, and you're outnumbered by the peasants you've just taken over. So isn't it better to give them a nice story as to why it's actually legitimate for you to be in charge? You pulled a sword out of a stone, or God said so, or whatever else. And finally, your plunder begins to become rather more formalized. And you think, well, actually, the better these people live, the more crops they grow, the more I can steal from them. So actually, it's to my advantage that they prosper. And so in this respect, for the most selfish but also rational reasons, a bandit usurper can become a king. And I'm not saying that every single state is created that way, but frankly, if you look back, most of them do in the absence of an alternative authority. And if you look at the modern world, places where the state truly collapses, places like Somalia, places like Afghanistan, actually, again, it's often these kinds of figures who begin to emerge. Tribal warlords in Afghanistan, the Puntland Republic in Somalia, and so forth. It's just someone who has more muscle and just thinks, actually, I can parlay my capacity to deploy violence into something bigger.
How much, because you are kind of describing something about the beginning, of course, the beginning of nation states, but kind of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the companies that gave their workers 8-hour days were not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They were doing it exactly for the reasons you've just outlined, because they figured that if they had rested workers, they would be more productive.
Yeah, but this is because the underworld and the upper world, that we have this kind of cozy notion that they are two separate things. There is the legitimate world, and then there are those bad guys, and those bad guys who, sit and plot their bank raids in a particularly disreputable boozer and so forth. Actually, these are two worlds, which firstly, because they're made up of human beings with the same impulses and the same expectations, but also they are directly interconnected much more frequently than we are often comfortable admitting. I mean, again, think about the way capital was accumulated, which ended up helping bankroll the Industrial Revolution. I mean, often it was in ventures which somewhere at least would be described as truly criminal. Whether we're talking about the slave trade, which after all sort of again, was a legitimate trade, except where it was an illegitimate trade.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Whether we're talking about, well, later on, it will be the Opium Wars that helped continue to push opium into India, or piracy. I mean, piracy and smuggling were two crucial ways in which people who had money invested to make a lot more money. And that money then in due course gets reinvested in the legitimate sector. So again, as far back as we go, I mean, you can take examples. Obviously, the historical record is much, much weaker. But, one can pick up examples from ancient Greece, from ancient Rome and elsewhere about the degree to which there is a kind of a feedback loop between illegal and legal earnings.
I mean, in a way, there has to be, if you want to acquire great wealth, more wealth than the productive capacity of the country can handle, you're going to have to either take it from other people by force, or you're going to have to get the productive capacity of other humans and just not pay them enough. So you have slavery.
And you have to launder it as well often. I mean, either you're laundering your own reputation, you're providing some kind of legitimate explanation for why you're suddenly rich, but also you're actually laundering your own income in order to demonstrate that it's not actually the product of criminal earnings. So, one way or the other, again, you may well make money in the criminal sector, but then you will want to find reasons why that money can safely be used to buy yourself luxuries and prestige and position in the legitimacy.
And so, how far do you go with this argument? I'm kind of wondering how much of it you really believe. Like, do you honestly think that that's what is happening in these states that we live in currently?
I mean, look, no, I mean, it is not the same thing. I mean, this is the trouble. If you're writing something for a more sort of broad audience, you want to have a nice, eye-catching message. And in the process, there's always the risk that nuance gets stripped out. And sometimes people are saying, oh, so you're saying that all societies are criminal. No, they're not. Not least because actually human beings do have a desire for comfort. And I don't just simply mean a nice padded armchair. I mean that sense that you have a law enforcement structure that protect, once you've, it's a classic example, when you're robbing banks, you want there to be no police around. Once you own banks, you want there to be a police force to protect it.
Right, exactly.
You don't want people to be regarding you as a threat, and therefore that you have to constantly be sort of surrounded by armed guards and such like. So people will want to acquire legitimacy, and also people will want to tell themselves that they are good people. Very few people have got that kind of degree of sociopathy that's able to say, I'm a really unpleasant, parasitic individual, and I'm fine with that. We all are engines of self-rationalization. But that's a good thing, because it actually gives us reasons to act in ways that are positive, even if it's not really coming from a positive place. And so I think the way society has emerged, yes, we can't call it organised crime because crime is defined by laws. And by definition, the people who are creating it is time before their laws, or else they're writing the laws. But when it comes down to it, I mean, the initial impetus for state building is actually people who have the capacity to impose their will, largely by force, on others, actually finding a community on which they could exercise that. But they, in turn, tend to get house-trained. I mean, if one looks at, for example, the role of the medieval church, and okay, we are bouncing around a lot, but then again, in many ways, my book is an exercise in massive self-indulgence as I bounce around from one thing that interests me to the next.
Ancient Rome,
but, the medieval church was crucial. Was crucial in house training, with the sort of notions of chivalry and the like. What up to that point had been a very unruly bunch of, essentially warlords and proto-warlords in armour.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think there is something very interesting about that argument, and I'm very interested in it because I think some of the countries that I've spent a lot of time on, like Iraq and Syria, have gone through this period where there was a war and catastrophic destruction of the nation state, and then the nation state has to be rebuilt along certain lines, and then the question becomes, well, on what lines of consent do you build it? And I think that's hugely interesting. I don't think that the Iraqis didn't rebuild it along gangster lines, but they did rebuild it along religious lines, because there has to be some way that the public accepts authority. Where does that authority come from? And so that aspect of it, if we are going to follow the kind of logic of the thesis to its end, I do think there's an aspect of legitimacy. It's not just that these states are criminal enterprises and they're forcing people to accept it. It's that the public in some way acquiesces in it because they want that stability. Yeah. They don't want their kids to be kidnapped on the way to school. They don't want to be killed on their way to work, things like that.
Well, this is a crucial thing. Exactly. The people who can mobilise armed force are also the people who can provide you with protection.
Right.
And in an anarchic era, in particular, but generally speaking, we want to feel safe. And in that respect, you might think, the same way as, look, no one, I think, is enthusiastic about paying their taxes. No one says, yay, it's self-assessment season again. It's just you realise that not only is that something that you regard as legitimate, however grudgingly, that you believe that state and society need to be funded and this is how you do it, but also because you sit there and think, well, actually, on balance, I want there to be a police force. I want there to be a fire brigade. I want there to be an ambulance service. And this is how it gets funded. Obviously, the alternative is we go back to the old model whereby, you more or less take out private insurance for your fire service and you hire a thief taker if someone steals from your goods. But I think we've accepted that that's definitely not the best way of doing it.
What's a thief taker?
A thief taker is essentially a private individual who is engaged to go and regain your property when it's been stolen. So, again, it's a sort of a kind of a bounty hunter for goods.
Wow, that would really, I didn't know about that. You'd really have to think carefully about how much the price of the thief taker was. Because, I mean, if the person stole something which is only worth, $100, you don't want to pay $120 to get it.
Well, no, but it creates these fascinating kind of perverse incentives. I mean, thief takers also obviously caught criminals, again, on a bounty basis. But, I mean, there were many thief takers in Britain who clearly what they did is they ran criminal organisations themselves. So in some ways, they would directly or indirectly arrange for thefts.
Right, and then they get them.
And then easily, in effect, monetize those thefts by selling the stuff back to the owners.
Well, I mean, this, I think, we started with the submarine one. And this, I think, is why I find this big crime, that was my point earlier about enjoying these schemes so much, is that the sheer economics of it makes so many crazy things possible. When you were talking about the submarine, the amount of money that, I think in the end, you'll correct me, but I think in the end, the amount of money that the submarine cost, because they did build one of these things, it's called the Che, I think. It cost about $1 million to build. But the amount of cocaine on it would have netted like 100 million in Europe. That is a completely economically rational thing to do.
Exactly, and to think that actually there are people who sit there thinking, okay, well, we will now build semi-submersibles that can cross the ocean. Even if the poor sods in it have to basically be peeing into plastic bags and eating sort of ration bars for the whole thing. But nonetheless, the money is quite extraordinary. And this brings us back to the extent to which, again, the overlap between the upper world and the underworld. I mean, it is now impossible to unpick dirty money from clean within the financial sector because actually our banks are stuffed with dirty money, as long as someone has the courtesy to pre-wash it.
Yeah, I'll come to that part because I think that's very interesting, particularly as it pertains to London and New York. You write in the book that a crime doesn't just pay, it tells. It is the dark shadow of the upper world being the legitimate world as a contrast to the underworld. Its shape, this is a quote, its shape defined by the contours of the society which cast it. So what do you think we in the upper world, he says, speaking to the police listening, in the upper world, can we learn from our reflection in the underworld?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's worth noting that, never mind the police and so forth, we all understand something about our society by looking at our crime. Firstly, because what is it that we criminalise? At the moment, there's huge debates about decriminalising certain drugs and such like. But the crucial thing is, in some ways, there is a moral economy of the state, what the state thinks is right and wrong. And then there is the moral economy of society, or at least large portions of society. And let's be perfectly honest, very, very few of us will have never committed a crime. If that is defined by, we have never passed the speed limit. We have never put in something that really is a slightly dodgy expense in our tax account, or bought something from a car boot sale which may become of dubious provenance, etc., etc. But in a way, those are things that we rationalise away as petty and minor. Then there are times when actually those two moral economies are very widely apart. Classic example being prohibition in the United States, when actually, as far as society was concerned, this was a moral, and political and social experiment being foisted on it by a small number of lawmakers. And on the whole, most Americans were thinking, no, actually, there's nothing wrong with having booze. And what happened was, therefore, essentially a huge criminal market was created. So often, looking precisely at where organised crime can operate, it is clearly within this no man's land. Between, a democracy ought to have a relatively narrow one, that actually state and society ought to be fairly closely in harmony. But in other societies, often there is a big gap, and that is defined by and colonized by organised crime. So the first thing is it tells us basically how far state and society are in accord. The second thing is particularly actually individual communities. What happens clearly, we saw this, for example, with Jewish communities in the Middle Ages and later, who were being constrained physically into ghettos and economically into certain enterprises. But generally, whether we're talking about marginalized ethnic or religious communities or particular sort of social categories, again, if you push them out of legitimate sectors of activity, they are going to move into illegitimate sectors. So it's all, in some ways, a way of understanding essentially the dysfunctions within the upper world manifest themselves in the underworld.
I suppose then you would say, if the dysfunctions in the upper world manifest themselves in the underworld, that you should be able to tell how far apart the government is from the people by looking at these manifestations. So if you look at... Well, maybe we should start. I like this example you drew in the book, and I can't remember the exact language, but you were talking about Russia, of course, an area you know well, about the two different words that the Russians use for various types of crimes. I can't remember the detail of it.
Yeah, I mean, prestouplение, which is the kind of the technical word for crime as defined by something which is against the law. And zlodeяние, which is crime more in the sense of something, a moral failing, a wickedness.
Right.
And we would hope that the two would mesh. Right. But in practice, it's clear that the two are often very different.
And that means that there are some things that the public says, listen, these aren't really crimes. The people in Moscow have written the laws, but these aren't crimes. And then there's other things that everyone goes, yeah, I mean, you shouldn't kill my neighbor. That is a crime, like that.
Well, I mean, but often it's things, I mean, killing the neighbor probably, unless you happen to be in the right uniform, would be considered also a crime in the law. But it's things like, I mean, for example, corruption.
Yes, right.
I mean, that for the moment is a very hot issue because technically corruption is against the law, but in practice there is a sense that it too rarely, when it comes to people high up in the system, too rarely gets prosecuted. That is an area where often they would use terms which are more like, more moral terms, because in some ways they think the law has given up on it. So again, it's also a way of indicating and measuring actually how far people feel that the law protects them and actually applies to everyone equally, which clearly, and very rarely is this actually in any society, but in some other societies it is much more glaring.
It's much more glaring, right, absolutely. So what do you think, let's hold up a mirror to our own societies, what do you think you see in our societies, in America and Britain and Western European societies, that you think indicates something is wrong with the upper world? Like, what crimes are we looking at and thinking those are reflections of what's happening in the upper world?
Well, I mean, look, let me give you two examples. In all the use of marijuana in, well, not just the UK, but so many Western countries. Obviously, this is an area in which, for many people, not all, I mean, there's by no means a sort of a national consensus, but, but there are a lot of people who think, actually, this should not be a crime. This is no worse than alcohol or cigarettes or all sorts of other sort of acceptable, socially sanctioned forms of narcotization. And therefore, it's very hard for this to be properly policed. And the police themselves are often thinking, look, why are we wasting our time when there are more serious crimes? And so there is a call for decriminalisation. Of course, that is one of the two approaches. I mean, the other approach is to actually try and win over the public opinion and actually say, look, there are significant risks to this. But, at the moment, clearly that's not being done successfully. So this is one of the areas where we see the widest gap, I would say.
Yeah, and that only works, it's a bit like telling kids not to take drugs. It only works up until the point they see other people take drugs and loving it. And then they go, I don't think it is that dangerous, Jacob seems to be fine.
It is, but I mean, if we look, actually there's been an astonishingly successful campaign against tobacco. If one looks, historically, and that means everything from taxing it to cutting down on illegal and counterfeit, all the way through to actually banning positive representations in film and TV, and that has worked. But again, in part, it's worked because actually there is a core, which is actually lung cancer is not fun. You can start from that and move out. Right. But the second example, and again, it's something I talk about in the book, is I remember going for a ride along with New Jersey State Troopers into Newark, which is a city just outside the rather confusingly named New York. And this was for a warrant that went live at 6 o'clock in the morning. So the idea is they're going to kick down the relevant door at 6:01. And the fascinating thing was the whole kind of operation was prepared well outside city limits. And this sort of convoy of vehicles then rolled out. I mean, again, being Americans, it was actually on the radio, it was the train is rolling, told us that the convoy was moving. And they left until the very last minute, literally when the first vehicle was crossing city limits, to call the local police and tell them, because there was so much corruption within the Newark police force. And then, as we were going through the centre of Newark, Newark has this weird reverse commute, because essentially it's people who do all the crappy night jobs in New York. So it's the janitors and the cleaners and the dustmen and everything else, which means that it's really busy, and you have a lot of people on street corners selling newspapers. And as our convoy rolled past, you saw them all pulling out their phones because they're all acting as spotters for local drug gangs. And it really brought home the fact that, and I'd actually lived for 2 memorable weeks in Newark, in a house that looked fine, except that turned out that the street had a gang house at one end and a drug house at the other. So we had 3 fatal shootings in 2 weeks in that street. But the point is, Newark is precisely, it is in many ways an area that is, I wouldn't say totally outside of police control. If you walk through downtown Newark in the middle of the day, it looks just like any other moderately impoverished American city. But in practice, this was the territory, it was Bandit Kingdom, it was the territory of the gangs. And so when the New Jersey State Troopers rolled in, while they were there, they had more and bigger guns than anyone else. There was a very demonstrable presence to actually say, hey, the state is in town today. But everyone knew that at some point, in an hour or two's time, they'd have to go somewhere else because there'll be another challenge, and the streets would return to the control of the gangs.
And those are the people you're worried about because they know where you live and they know who you are.
Exactly. But also, they are often the least of all evils. Again, if we're going back to this whole business of sort of state structures creating, I mean, what happened is in practice that the local gangs protect you from the even more dangerous gangs of the street next door. So, from the point of view of the residents there, the local gangs may be unpleasant, but they are often the lesser of evils because they also protect you from the even more predatory gangs of the street next door. So here we have, two examples. One of them is actually a crime, taking marijuana, relatively sort of petty drugs. That is widespread because of this gap between moral economies. And then another example from the States of a kind of geographical gap. That there are, frankly, Newark is a depressing and depressed place, and effectively the state has lost traction over the place.
I think you see a lot of this. I want to move into the kind of the bigger picture. We touched on it earlier about the way that the money is then laundered and it exists all around us. I mean, the Newark example is a good one because you see that these criminal networks are everywhere. They're not just somewhere far away in a different country, like you've talked about Chechnya, for example. They are really among you, and they're just outside America's most expensive city, as Mamdani said. So if you think about how you see this all the time in a place like London, which I think you can see it kind of consciously. Like there's so much of the prime property market in London has essentially become a safety deposit box for the global elite. And actually, you saw this exposed by the Ukraine war because suddenly, I'm sure you knew this before, but suddenly the papers were filled with these images of these palatial London mansions, all owned by Russian oligarchs. And I think, a lot of people just who didn't know about that stuff, they look at it and they go, okay, so you guys have known about this for a long time. You didn't just suddenly find out that Abramovich has a mansion in Chelsea. You've known about this for years. So it's part of the way the system works. It's not an aberration.
No, absolutely. And look, the issue of oligarchs, and it's not just Russian, but you name it, having property and assets generally secreted around London. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that's the least of it. That's visible and evident and often particularly objectionable as we talk about people having 50-bedroom mansions that they don't live in, while other people can't find anywhere to live. But actually, this is just simply the manifestation of the financial flows, the degree to which London, and in fairness, the other key hubs of global capitalism, New York, Frankfurt, have simply become, I wouldn't want to say dependent, but nonetheless, shall we say, sort of entirely codependent with criminal sectors.
You should say dependent. Your colleague, not colleague, but I mean a fellow writer, Oliver Bulow, who came on this podcast a couple of years ago, he talked about how the way that the British financial system helps Russian oligarchs and others, as you say, Azerbaijanis and so on, hide their money, has become, this is a quote, Britain's post-imperial business model.
It's part of it. I think Oliver's great, and anyone who likes my book ought to have already read his books. But I think the point is, as I said, it's not actually a British disease quite as much. I think this is where maybe it's I find myself unfashionably standing up for Britain, and my great moral rallying cry is the Brits are no worse than anyone else.
Okay,
which counts. I think counts as quite radical these days. No, but I mean the point is that yes, there is a huge amount of criminal money in the British financial system, but that's because there's a huge amount of money in every financial system. It's just that often the banks are smaller. Because what you look at, if you turn up with a suitcase full of $100 bills still smudged with cocaine to a British bank, they will call the police. If you have had the courtesy to pre-wash it, let's say, the way the money laundering chains work. So let's say you manage to get this money put into a bank in Bogota. And, it's interesting. I mean, Bogota is a place where, surprisingly enough, there are a lot of banks. Or maybe not so surprising after all.
Yeah.
But that's, shall we say, a dodgy financial jurisdiction. So then you bounce it through other ones, slowly moving it closer and closer to the sort of the gold standard AAA ones. So maybe it moves through places like, where are some of the more infamous money launderers? Israel, Cyprus. At which point it is sufficiently laundered that you can then take it to a British bank. Now, it's not that actually the British bank necessarily thinks that this is purely legitimate. The purpose of money laundering is just simply to bring deniability in.
Exactly.
So that the bank can say it's shocked to discover as and when. Someone I knew who used to work in the City of London in compliance, who left because, as she put it, her job was not actually to ensure that the bank was compliant. Her job was to ensure that no one could prove that it was not compliant.
It's part of the model. I think that's why I find these conversations so intriguing, because people are in New York and in London and in Frankfurt, people are so proud of the banking system, the financial system. People come here and they work, and it's one of the biggest sectors of the British economy. And yet at the same time, what is happening is that they are laundering money from all of these regimes and these people who have they acquired it in a dodgy fashion. And nobody seems to mind. Everybody seems to think it's perfectly okay, as long as you say, there's enough plausible deniability.
Yeah, exactly. We want to have our cake and eat it. We want that the dirty foreigners, lovely dirty money, but we also want to feel that we are sort of great standards of moral rectitude. But the point is, this applies to so much of the global economy. It's not just the money. I mean, I talk in the book about this sort of, and I had no idea about it until I was researching, but sand mafia. That global construction requires large quantities of good quality sand. And as a result, you have it being sucked up illegally from Indian beaches and from Chinese rivers, and then being sort of sold around the world. Wood, actually, how much of the items we get from, and I won't name names, but, certain high street furniture shops, in practice comes from illegal logging in places like Amazonia. I think this is it. We focus on the money, rightly. I mean, obviously, because that's absolutely crucial. That's who does crime other than to make it pay. But in so many ways, globalization and the way that's undermined the power of the nation state and the links between sources and final consumers actually has acted dramatically to open up new markets for criminal activities.
One more point about this, and then we'll move on. But I think I was very interested. One of the advantages of reading your book in PDF format is that you can search for things. And so I was really intrigued by this framing of the West doing business with the kleptocrats around the world. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it because I don't like this us and them framing. But I noticed that there was no mention in your book of these massive arms companies, BAE System, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. There is one mention of Raytheon. But it's the reason I bring it up is that I sometimes think that, just like in that, I'm sure you've seen this Mitchell and Webb sketch where the people in Nazi uniforms turn around and go, wait a second, are we the baddies? It's like it sometimes feels like we in the West are the baddies of these stories, but we act like we're not. Like these arms manufacturers are selling stuff and they're proving that they sold it by blowing up human bodies in various places in Afghanistan and so on. That's how they advertise that these things work. And yet we say, well, we're not complicit in it at all. We're just, if we have to be involved, we have to give them the weapons. But you don't have to give them the weapons.
Yeah, but what you're really illustrating again is this difference between prestouplenie and zlodziejanie. I mean, the arms companies actually are relatively carefully controlled. You have to have your end user certificates and everything else to sell it.
Okay, but I mean, that's a version of the plausible deniability.
Is legal.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we might regard it as wicked. So in some ways, this is actually, again, I mean, for me, one of the classic examples of times when we don't necessarily stop and think whether or not the actual working of some aspect of our society does fit within our moral economy. And why? Because it's happening somewhere else.
Well.
Now, if this was, the notorious civil war in Basingstoke that was being played out with British weapons, we probably would be paying a lot more attention to whether or not which warlord from whichever quarter of the place was involved. But it's on the other side of the world, and it's basically foreigners killing foreigners, so we care less.
I think we should move on to another war that is on the other side of the world, because the other part that you have written extensively about recently is this Russia-Ukraine war. So I think we should get into that, because I find that very fascinating. Well, let's get on to Ukraine, just because there's a lot happening in the news at the moment about it. I know it's something that you've written about for a long part of your career. Let's talk about this current peace plan. We're recording on Wednesday, and they're still sort of discussing this. Thanksgiving is tomorrow. Apparently, this 28-point peace plan is going to be somehow agreed by Thanksgiving. You quoted a British diplomat who said that in the current circumstances, this plan may be Kiev's best hope. It's not perfect, but it's not final either, and it could in some way offer a way to end the killing and allowing us to focus on building Ukraine. Do you roughly concur with that diplomat's assessment?
I do. I mean, look, I don't know if this will at all work. The odds are still against it. We now don't actually have the Thanksgiving deadline. It's been sort of blurred, and we have different iterations and different versions of plans. And so it's very hard to know exactly where we are. And frankly, that's the point. It's only through engaging that we actually test whether or not, for example, Putin is willing to reach a peace at any price at the moment. But what I would say is precisely that we actually do have a moment in which, while I can't say I'm optimistic, I'm more optimistic than I've been for a long time.
You've described it elsewhere as it's the beginning of the end.
Potentially. I think, again, this is the thing, because up to now, especially in Europe, but generally within the West, but I think Europe has essentially satisfied itself with pious moral tone of saying the end to this war is easy, Russia should withdraw. Well, yes, that's perfectly true. And that is a little bit like saying we have, the simple answer to crime is that people should stop committing it. That is technically true, but not necessarily particularly helpful. I think the virtue of this particular moment is, look, the Russians are, I think it's fair to say, at present winning, but winning incredibly slowly and incredibly painfully.
At vast cost.
Yeah, exactly. 1.3 million dead and wounded is sort of the best current estimate, and an economy which is sliding into recession. So although I think Putin is very much signalling that he's perfectly willing to carry on fighting, and I think he is, he also has some kind of reason to see, well, if he gets the kind of deal that he can trumpet as a triumph, then he's at least willing to consider that. The Ukrainians are in a very tough spot at the moment. And Trump clearly, he doesn't give a monkeys about the Ukrainians or the war. He just wants this off his desk, and he wants the embarrassment of a war he claimed he could settle in 24 hours of actually just being out of the way. So in some ways, there are reasons why people, for their own entirely sort of self-interested basis, actually might want a peace. So we just have to see if that is some kind of compromise that is possible. As I say, I think it's more likely than not that it won't be possible, but it's a damn sight more likely than a year ago.
I mean, even if it is 50% of what is on those 28 points, it represents broadly a call for Ukrainian capitulation. People have often said, well, there's no way that Zelensky can accept this. I mean, someone can accept it. Somebody, if it's not Zelensky, they'll find another person to accept it, which I think was what was happening a few months ago. They were seemed like they were looking for an alternative to Zelensky. But it does feel as if Ukraine has to give up so much after so much tragedy and killing and loss of life. It's a very hard pill to swallow.
Absolutely is. Look, there's no way of getting around it. This or whatever peace deal that is agreed will almost certainly be dramatically unfair, an affront to international law as well as basic morality. But it also reflects the reality that on the whole, the country which is in a stronger position tends to predominantly shape the peace agreement. For me, the key thing is not, look, there is for the moment no theory of victory, no approach which would allow Ukraine to take back the 20% or so of its territory which it's lost.
Let alone Crimea and all of this.
Yeah. The question is, the 80% that's left, what can be done to ensure that it is secure and sovereign? That, for me, is the real battle. And talk about, for example, limiting the size of the Ukrainian military. On the one hand, people say, well, how can you be a sovereign country if you've got limits? Look, as is, 600,000, 800,000, as the Europeans are suggesting, either way, it's probably more than Ukraine could afford to field as a standing force anyway. I mean, the estimates I was getting from analysts at the British Ministry of Defence were 500,000 is about the sort of the limit. So this is a kind of a symbolic blow to Ukrainian sovereignty, but not actually making a huge difference. If they can crack the crucial issues of security guarantees for Ukraine, which are crucial, and they're not dependent on trust. You know, people say, oh, you can't trust Putin. Of course you can't trust Putin. Right. But what deal is based on, well, I shook him by the hand and he looked very honest basis? You know, there have to be absolutely cast iron principles.
It was George W. Bush who shook his hand and looked into his soul, and here we are 20 years later, and it's not going well, brother.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost as if that's actually not a useful basis for geopolitics.
One would imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, for me, the crucial things are going to be twofold. One of them is NATO membership, which again is in some ways symbolic. NATO does not want Ukraine within
Absolutely
it.
not.
That's clear.
Right.
But the point is the Russians don't really believe and trust that. They want a formal cast iron statement that says it won't join. And secondly, it's this remaining 20 or so % of Donetsk region that Putin seems to have made it his crucial final demand. And it may well be that is something that Zelensky or any Ukrainian leader cannot give up.
It's that part, just to explain for the audience, it's that part that the Russians haven't yet occupied but that they want to take. And you feel that politically it's very difficult for a Ukrainian leader to say to the people who died, defending it, hey, you died for nothing because we're just going to give it over.
Precisely. I mean, it is steeped in the blood of Ukrainian defenders. It is also strategically important. It contains the so-called fortress belt, 4 cities, heavily defended. And the idea is to hand this over to the Russians without a fight, when it will take them probably at least a couple of years to actually sort of battle their way through it, is too big. And, I mean, I was talking to some people in Kyiv who are connected to the security forces, and one of them was saying, look, Zelensky could not survive giving the order to surrender that. And when I say survive, do you mean politically? He said not necessarily. Now, I mean, who knows? Again, there's always the chance of a certain amount of hyperbole, but I think it does really demonstrate just how significant this may well be. And I think almost the trouble is that I think Putin has locked himself into a corner. It'd be very hard for him to actually say, well, this thing that I said was absolutely necessary. I actually come to think of it, nah, never mind. So I do think that may well be the rock on which this current thing founders.
I want to talk to you about the broader way in which the war has been portrayed, particularly in Europe, because one of the reasons that I really follow your analysis and I enjoy listening to you and reading you is because you seem to me to be one of the few commentators that recognizes that Russia is a superpower and is making advances on the battlefield and could potentially win. It strikes me that one of the major issues with the commentariat is that there's this desire to paint Russia as if it is, minutes away from collapse, as if Putin is going to be overthrown just on Tuesday. And I think to myself, for the last 3 years they've been saying this, and it hasn't happened. Do you agree with me that there seems to be this very pro-Ukraine tilt in the way that the war is discussed?
I think so. And look, I can understand it because the Russians are the aggressors. There's no question about this. Very few wars are polite and genteel affairs. But even by the standards of wars, this is a particularly ugly and unpleasant one. I mean, in many ways, it has all the sins of a civil war. That sense of kind of personal betrayal being activated. And I think, when it comes to Russia, because there is also this paradox that Russia is forever about to collapse and is also a massive existential threat to Europe, whose tanks are going to roll all the way to the Channel if Ukraine doesn't win. And I think in part, it reflects, and God, this is getting into very kind of pretentious pontifications, but about the whole social mediaification of the narrative. It's that we've reached a stage where kind of analysis and advocacy have pretty much blurred together. If I say, and this is something I often have to face, if I say, look, at present, well, my view is in some ways both sides are losing, but the Ukrainians are losing faster. Because if you look, for example, the Russians are still able to recruit 30,000 new soldiers a month and so forth. Some people say, how dare you talk down Ukraine?
Yeah, right.
And I'm saying, well, I'm not. I mean, I don't think that anyone is advantaged by me just giving in to wishful thinking, and actually think that because the Ukrainian side is just, then a host of unicorns will suddenly gallop forth and turn the tide of battle. But that does seem to be very much a kind of almost a passé perspective to take, because exactly advocacy is more important than analysis.
I wonder if it goes even deeper than that. I want to stick with this. I mean, it genuinely fascinates me because, as you say, people look at you as if suddenly, you're on the payroll of Putin, when you are just pointing out, as you have just said, Russia may be losing 1,000 soldiers per day, but it is recruiting another 1,000. And I think when you put it like that, you realize the scale of this country. I was at an event over the weekend, and it was pointed out to me that if you add up the populations of all the countries along Russia's western border, meaning from Finland through Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, all the way down to the Mediterranean to Greece, it's still around half the population of Russia. And you forget the sheer scale of this country. So when people talk about a war, it seems to me an incredibly obvious thing to go, yeah, it's a big country. It's got nuclear weapons and a lot of soldiers. Of course, it's going to, even in a grinding conflict, it's going to eventually overwhelm its neighbors. But that, as you say, doesn't just seem to be passé. People think it's some sort of betrayal.
Yeah, I mean, and look, even then, this is on the other problems. Victory and defeat is a words that get used but never defined. What does it actually mean? I mean, a Russian victory in Ukraine does not mean that the Russians are going to roll right across the country. We're actually talking about haggling over the front line and the precise terms of any post-war settlement that is imposed on Ukraine and the benefits that Russia could extract through sort of sanctions relief and the like. Yes, this will be a victory for aggression if this is concluded. But it is not actually this kind of catastrophic defeat that some people almost seem to portray. Just as victory, what does victory for Ukraine mean? Frankly, it means they managed to hold the line and don't lose any more territory, rather than that they chase the Russians out of every square centimetre of occupied territory. But there's very little willingness to actually engage with what happens behind the words. We have these mantras. We all support Ukraine as long as it takes,
right,
whatever they need, but clearly not whatever they need.
And not as long as it takes.
No, exactly. But the mantras are much more comforting than really getting involved in the detail and actually having to address issues like, for example, the relative disproportion of Russia compared with Ukraine. And frankly, the limits of what the West is willing to do for Ukraine.
I always imagined that there must have been a moment, you have the Western leaders, like Boris Johnson and others, going before the camera saying, we're with Ukraine until the end, we'll give them so much. And then I like to imagine that they take Zelensky aside after and go, we're just so we're just saying that, right? We don't really, we've got an election in 4 weeks, so, you got to wrap this up.
I mean, even if they didn't do that, I think Zelensky definitely has got the message by now.
Exactly, yeah. But I think I want to stick with this because I think of it in terms of, I know you talked about it as being a social media phenomenon. I think of it more in terms of being the manufacturing of consent from the political establishment. And I want to talk about two messages, the second of which is related to a previous book of yours. Let's stick with the first one. And this is about what you just described, where the political leadership of Western European countries talks about Russia as an enormous threat that will require blood sacrifice. You saw it just this week where the French army chief said that France has to be willing to lose its children in a war with Russia. And I find it absolutely shocking when this stuff is said. It was said last year as well by the head of the British Army. Again, really astonishing that people think in the rich world that might happen. And I wonder if what is really going on is the political pact that Western democracies have with their citizens is being upended. Because the political pact, it seems to me, is a version of, look, you pay for this enormous military expenditure, and in return, there won't be a return to war on Western soil. And it doesn't seem like that is happening anymore. It sounds like now they're preparing the ground for us really to actually have to fight and send our kids, or in cases some of us, to war.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that for me is very much that we should never underestimate the degree to which fear is a handy political instrument. And by saying, basically, next Wednesday, Putin will try and come and eat your babies, It is a way of saying this justifies all kinds of things that we are doing. This justifies what we're doing with Ukraine. This justifies what we're doing about increasing our defence spending. Meant to go up after all. We have the new NATO figure of 3.5% plus 1.5% should be the objective. Good luck with anyone reaching that, unless they absolutely sort of are sitting on the front line or they have other reasons to do so. The importance of fear as a mobilising force is a very depressing one. And in that respect, Putin has his virtues. I mean, he does lend himself to being a bogeyman figure. The aging despot who has his murder, his victims thrown out of windows. A lot of this is exaggerated.
They really threw that guy out of the window.
Caricature.
The person you're thinking of, they really chucked him out of the window. Yeah.
Someone did, but whether it was the state is another matter. But the point is, I think, when you don't have a more positive message, negative ones tend to work pretty well. And, again, if you're talking about the current political elite, they can't really use the migrants so much because that plays to rival political forces. There is no clear enemy within. But on the other hand, big bad Russians is actually very handy, even while actually there is still a lot of Russian money sloshing through our banking system and our goods still end up in Russian shops.
But it sounds like you don't fully believe that is real. But if it's not real, they're really trying to manufacture consent for these things. I mean, we're not talking about putting up a trial balloon by somebody on the fringes of the establishment. In both cases, in France and Britain, these were the sitting heads of the National Army saying these things. When the sitting head of the National Army says, you guys, in Britain, this is what he said, you guys are the pre-war generation, you have to prepare for a land war, you start to think, is this guy serious? Are we really going to have to do this?
Yeah, I mean, look, ironically enough, I am supportive of Europe arming itself. In part because, although I don't actually believe Putin has any hostile intent in the sense of actually wants to invade NATO, mess with us, lean on us, etc., absolutely. But, I appreciate that I could be wrong. And also it's about avoiding temptations, not just for Putin, but a post-Putin leader who might be rather different. But it's also because up to now, Europe has infantilized itself by sheltering under the American security umbrella. And now it finds that that's not necessarily always a very comfortable place to be in terms of your capacity to influence Washington.
Absolutely.
But nonetheless, at the same time, I am shocked and horrified by a lot of these claims about the imminence of war. People saying by sort of 2029, the Russians will be coming and what that means.
Yeah, right.
But I can't help thinking that often this is mobilized for particular sectoral need. And again, if you are the head of the armed forces, you want more money. You want money that will allow you to buy all those shiny new pieces of kit that you want, kit that is becoming ridiculously eye-wateringly expensive.
Really, yeah.
I love the term exquisite is being used now, exquisite capabilities, which basically just means unaffordable. We also have a situation in which actually, in many countries, people don't want they don't want to fight.
Of course.
You have opinion polls showing sort of these very small proportions of people who actually say that they would fight to defend their country. Now, okay, it's different when it actually happens.
Yes, right.
But nonetheless, I think there is a concern precisely about recruitment and the like. So there are sectoral interests within the defence ministries and the defence industrial complex and their lobbyists and all that. But then there's also the wider issue, I think, of actually having an enemy figure allows you to play we need to roll up our sleeves and accept that we're not going to have all the nice things we wanted, like pensions. And instead, because we face this terrible existential ogre figure, threat that is just over our borders.
I like that theory. I wonder if it explains something that I've also been pondering. Now, I know you've been following Russia and Ukraine for a while, and I have to a lesser degree. I've been lucky enough to report from both of those countries. I wonder if you were surprised, as I was, by how quickly Europeans rallied around Ukraine after 2022, when so few of them, and again, I think nobody I know who's Ukrainian should listen to this podcast, but so few of them would have known much about Ukraine before that. Mm-hmm. And yet they immediately got on board with it. Some of them took in Ukrainian refugees. Do you explain that, as you were saying, that it's been a necessary evil for political establishments?
No, I think it also reflects a genuine and entirely laudable sense that this is an underdog nation that is being terribly treated, hence willingness to take in Ukrainian refugees and fly Ukrainian flags and so forth. There's also a degree to which It is a safe way of feeling virtuous, which we all like. But I must admit, there's also another dimension which I throw in here. I've had quite a few conversations with people in what, unfortunately, I haven't really got a better term from the global south, who particularly are often finding themselves facing the problems of secondary sanctions. For example, if you buy Russian oil or gas, you might get sort of slapped with sanctions. And I'm talking to a West African diplomat who called this economic imperialism. We're being told to do this because of a war that we don't care about. You didn't care about any of the wars that we were fighting, but suddenly it's white guys fighting white guys on Europe's border. And this is something that the whole world has to pay attention to. So I think there is a sense that it's not just genuine humanitarianism. It is also a shock to find that Europeans can actually find themselves at war again, because war was meant to be something that happened safely far away. It was essentially wars of intervention against people in dusty caves.
Yeah, this is partly what I meant about the pact between the political establishment and the publics in the Europe being unraveled. Because, you will all remember, and certainly those of us in the media remember it very clearly, how the Western media turned up in Kiev and they said things like, we're just shocked to see white people as refugees. And you go, yeah? You don't seem to be shocked when other people with more melanin turn out to be refugees. And it was that aspect of it that people just couldn't get their heads around, the idea that these people look like us, but they are in trouble. I think, for a lot of people, in the West and, as you say, in the global South, that's what it felt like. It felt like the whole world was being forced to pay attention to this one particular war when there are, I don't know how many, 50 wars raging around the world?
Yeah, increasingly so. Yes, quite. But I think it's also the degree to which, again, this is a war that is convenient for many individuals and interests. Take, for example, Poland, which has been very forthright in its support for Ukraine, providing all sorts of financial, military assistance and the like. Also spending an obscene amount of money on building its armed forces. It's ordered 1,000 modern main battle tanks, which means it'll have more modern tanks than the Russians will. But why is this? Is it because of huge amounts of solidarity with the Ukrainians, with whom there are long historical and ethnic connections? Well, maybe. But on the other hand, when Polish farmers started to get worried about Ukrainian agricultural produce coming across their borders into the European Union, they blockaded the border points. There are limits to that. This is also part of the way in which actually Poland establishes itself really as the new security guarantor of Central Europe, given that Germany is regarded as having essentially abdicated this role. So, it's a complex of so many things, from just simply, a kind of orientalizing horror that war could come to white people, all the way through to the interests of particular political and military elites, to nations mobilizing it and such like. And in the process, often the war and the very real horrors that Ukrainians themselves face simply becomes used as a backdrop or as a useful supply of handy talking points and video clips. You should
never let a good crisis go to waste. I want us to end, because we're right at the end now, but I want to just ask you about the second part, because this talks to a previous book that you wrote. So you wrote a book. I'm talking now about the second part of the messaging from government. And you wrote a previous book called The Weaponization of Everything, A Field Guide to the New Way of War. The messaging that we've just discussed is about how, Russia is 6 days away from rolling into London. But then the other side of the messaging is that, look, everything is normal. We've got this. You don't have to worry about it beyond spending money on it. And you describe in that book, which I think you wrote pre the invasion of Ukraine, just on the border, actually, you described in that book how so much of modern warfare is now what might be called a grey zone war, where you have all these levels of conflict below outright violence. So we're talking about sabotage, the influencing of culture wars, misinformation, and so on like that. We are already in that war with Russia, aren't we?
We are already in that war with everyone. The central point is, look, when the United States leans on Britain and European countries to impose certain kinds of sanctions, with the threat that they themselves may face economic repercussions if they don't get it, how is that anything other than economic warfare? I think that the truth of the matter is that one of the central themes of that book is to acknowledge that in some ways we all operate on a spectrum of conflict with everyone else. And yes, sometimes that reaches a stage of overt, whether it's sabotage or all the way through to actual warfare. But much of the time it's sublimated into all kinds of other realms. So yes, we are in that position in Russia. I always have trouble, though, with the idea of saying we are at war with Russia, because if I write this in something scholarly, I can include all the caveats and the footnotes to explain what I mean by war. When we just use it as it gets deployed as a soundbite, then it's suddenly a lot more scary. And it implies that you might say everything is in the mix. Putin is perfectly happy to try and mess with the West. He clearly is doing so in order to distract us, to demoralize us, and to divide us. That does not mean to say that he's equally willing to send troops over the border and provoke a war with the most powerful military alliance in history. But this is the danger. If you just use the W word on its own, that's where it leads us to.
So I guess, to kind of wrap this up, when we were talking about crime, you were suggesting that the public is comfortable with a certain level of crime because it's kind of there in the background, they don't notice it. I wonder if we are talking about warfare, conflict maybe. Do you think that the public is comfortable with a certain level of grey zone warfare?
Yes, I think it has to be, because we are constantly facing it. Our intelligence services act in support of our companies when they are trying to sort of clinch major arms deals abroad, or at least certain intelligence services, and I wouldn't want to mention the French specifically, do so particularly aggressively. All countries are seeking to maneuver and pitch and achieve certain national goals. And sometimes they do that by perfectly overt ways. Sometimes they do it by slightly more shadowy, grey zone-ish kind of ways. And yes, I think the irony is that essentially we expect that. I mean, if one looks at, for example, the Brexit negotiations, we had cases of certainly claims that intelligence services were bugging the other people's negotiating teams. And in some ways, Europe was clearly using the weight of its economic capacity, its market, as a way of bringing pressure to bear on the UK. Now, under other circumstances, that could have been described as economic warfare. We just chose to regard it as hard-nosed negotiating. But so much of this is frankly semantics. Now, again, the danger is that everything becomes conflict. We have to try and define it. But anyway, the part of the point of that book, and this is now a shift into a moment of shameless self-promotion, was precisely to get us thinking beyond the usual crude categories of war and not war.
Mark Galeotti, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. Mark Galeotti's new book, Homo Criminalis, and the new paperback version of his previous book, We Need to Talk About Putin, are out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.